I want to start right in today. Oh, first of all, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. Okay, so you people, a lot of you people have been writing for the last 2 days, really, but in huge numbers today, asking about what appears to be a Facebook post that's going around by Trump's sometime legal advisor, Jenna Ellis, explaining that this is all a setup and that, in fact, Joe Biden is not going to win the election and that Donald Trump is going to pull it out at the end. And I'm going to explain to you what she is talking about, but I'm going to tell you right up front, this is delusional. All right, so put your mind to rest about that. So what she is suggesting is this: that as of yesterday, the Electoral College went ahead and it voted. So again, remember, technically, when you vote for president, you're actually not voting for the president. You're actually voting for the electors, the members of the delegates to the Electoral College. And I may or may not, if you want me to explain that again, I've explained it a lot of times. Maybe it'd be more effective actually to explain in a future talk why we might not want to have it any longer. But in any case, you're technically voting for members of the Electoral College. And so technically, we do not have a president until those electors have voted. Now, in our history, and certainly recently, it's very easy for the states simply to tally their votes and register their votes and say, certify their votes. Let me tell you exactly how this happens. People go in, they vote. On the lead up to election day and then on election day. And then in some states, it's okay for votes to come in later so long as they are postmarked on the day of election day. Then people literally sit and count the votes, and they do it in a number of different ways. Each state is different. Then the states have to decide who won. So the states, you literally take, if you're from the town of, I don't know, East Podunk or San Antonio, you bundle your votes and you tell the state what you have found. You deliver the votes, and the state says, okay, yeah, we agree with these, and they are certified. And in each state, that's different. I mean, some states are duplicates, but like sometimes it's the governor who certifies it, sometimes it's a committee. There's all kinds of different ways in which that's done. So we know very quickly who has won an election, but it is not official until the Electoral College actually casts its votes, which is what happened yesterday. So the Electoral College has spoken. The election is over with this last stage to go in place. Those Electoral College votes have to be transmitted to Congress, and Congress on January 6th will go ahead and certify those results. So what that Facebook post by Ellis said was that at that point, that's when everything's going to happen and Trump's going to pull it out. So the way that this would happen, were this the case, is that under the rules of Congress, it's a joint session of Congress. So under the rules of Congress, as long as one senator and one representative complains about a slate of electors from a state, and they have to do it state by state. Say they complain about the electors from the state of Maine. I'll pick on Maine. They're not going to, but if they were, one from the House, one from the Senate would say, no, I don't agree with these. These are wrong. And when that happens, each house goes back into its own chambers and they debate for up to 2 hours about whether or not they're going to accept these or not. So what is likely going to happen is that in the House, there are Republican members of the House who are going, when they hear the state tallies counted for swing states that they think should be in, for some reason I keep thinking Nixon, in Trump's column, they're going to object to them. And that's not uncommon. So, for example, when George W. Bush and Gore were slugging it out in 2000, one of the Democratic leaders in the House wanted to challenge George W. Bush's count in Florida, because Florida is where he won by 537 votes, and the vote got stopped and all that. And there was actually kind of reason to think that maybe should have been debated in Congress, but by then the Supreme Court had spoken and it didn't go anywhere. So that's not that uncommon. So the question is, will anybody in the Senate agree? Because if somebody in the Senate agrees, then the houses have to go and chat about those particular electoral votes from that state. Right now, it doesn't look like any Republican senators will do that. But even if they do, so it doesn't look like it's going to happen, but even if it does, then the houses will go back and they'll chat. Is this legit? Is it not legit? And then they decide if those votes are legitimate by a simple majority. So it's not going to be a question of a 2/3 vote or whatever, the way it sometimes is in the Senate, especially. So what you are looking for is essentially you would have to have in the Senate. The House is a Democratic House, so it's obviously going to go ahead and agree to go ahead with the votes that the electors have provided. But in the Senate, you're going to need to have maybe as many as 4 senators go ahead and agree to certify the votes from those swing states. So that, theoretically, if all the Republicans refuse to certify those votes, then there would be a problem. But 4 of them have already said we're not playing this game. So and McConnell, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell came out today and said, "Congratulations, Joe Biden, you are our president-elect." So it does not look like that's going to happen. So technically, on the 6th, there probably will be a ruckus kicked up in the House, but this is such a sort of a ridiculous. If you remember, each step of the way, there's been this is our moment. So so I wanted to say a little bit here. So no, so this is not going to happen. And those of you who are really concerned about it, the rest of this is for you. Like, I'm telling you how this has worked. But you don't have to listen to me. But you also don't have to listen to Joe Ellis. I'm sorry, not Joe Ellis, Jenna Ellis. Joe Ellis is a historian. You don't have to listen to Jenna Ellis. You need to look at the facts on the ground. So I could tell you whatever I want you to know, and she could tell you whatever you want to know. Where do you go to get the real answer? In this case, as I keep saying, in the case of Donald Trump insisting that he has won this election, this is ridiculous. So and I'm going to explain why that's the case. Biden won this election by more than 7 million votes in the popular vote and by a vote in the Electoral College of 306 to 232. Those are not close votes. Now, remember, 4 times in our history, somebody has lost the popular vote and won in the Electoral College, something I think we're going to need to work out, including both George W. Bush and Donald Trump. The 2 last Republican presidents have lost the popular vote and won in the Electoral College. And there were no challenges over that. I mean, there were sort of, like I said, the sporadic stuff in the House, but for the most part, those went forward. So why is Donald Trump now trying to overturn what is a very clear election? So, there's all this talk about, he's saying there's fraudulent votes, there's stolen votes, there's found votes, there's all this kind of stuff. Now, he and his supporters are saying this stuff all over the media. It's everywhere, and it's in Facebook, as you all know. But there's no penalty in our society for lying. Bottom line, no penalty for lying, except under certain circumstances. And one of those circumstances is when you're in a courtroom, when you're in front of a judge. And so there have been, at this point, I believe it's 60 lawsuits launched by the by the Trump campaign challenging the results of this election in courtrooms. And when lawyers get into those courtrooms in front of judges, like when Giuliani did that thing and there were these people claiming that they'd seen this and seen that, that was not in a courtroom. That was like in an auditorium somewhere, and nobody was under oath. When you're in a courtroom, you have to tell the truth. You're under oath. You have their professional penalties that you will pay if you lie to a judge. So these people get in front of the courtroom and the judge will say, "Are you saying there's fraud?" And they say, "Well, no, that wasn't really what we were saying." And he says, "Are you saying that the Republicans weren't allowed to be in the room?" And they say, "No, that wasn't what we were saying either." And so the Trump campaign has lost 59 out of 60 court cases. And the one it was procedural. If you're losing 59 to 1 in a courtroom, that's something that rings on the barrelhead. Now, the Supreme Court also has been asked on 2 occasions to step into this, and it has decided against Trump, despite the fact that he appointed 3 of the justices that are there, and many of them are quite far on the right. They have decided against him each time. On the last 2 questions, on the last question by 0 to 9. This is not negotiable. This is People are muddying the water and making you think something is true by repeating it enough times. You can repeat it again and again and again and again, and sooner or later people think it's real and they get really worried about it and they get very afraid about it because what's going to happen next? Nothing's going to happen next. And that's actually a really interesting point that I want to get to in a second. So why is Trump doing this? Well, Trump is doing it because he's in real trouble. As you know by now, if you've been listening to me, since 1973, we have had a memo from the Department of Justice. It's not a law and it's never been tested in court that a sitting president cannot be indicted for crimes. Trump's people have tried to argue in court throughout his administration that a sitting president can also not be investigated for crimes. And that's indicative, I think, of the fact that he's concerned about what things might look like for him going forward. So he has the real problem with the fact that as of noon on January 20th, he is no longer going to be a sitting president. And at that point, he can be indicted for crimes. So the more that he whips people up to make it think that somehow he has been ill-served, the harder I think he is hoping to make it for, say, the Southern District of New York, who may well, or we know, has cases in the works against him. So he has an interest in doing that, but he also has an interest in fundraising. The Trump campaign and / the Republican National Committee, it's a little bit murky. It's not murky, it's very clear, but I wasn't going to go into the details. There's different percentages of what the two of them get depending on which fundraising campaign that they're working for. But Trump has been raising money off the idea that he's challenging these election results. And even today, he was on Twitter talking about how there's evidence of all this fraud. Well, there isn't. That's the whole point. The courts have found not a single instance of fraud that would have changed the outcome of the election. And I hedged that because there have been instances of fraud this time around, and they were committed by Republicans. So there's not hordes and hordes of fraud out there. You are literally more likely to get hit by lightning than voter fraud is likely to happen in this country, quite literally. So it's not there. So he's out there on Twitter today talking about how there's voter fraud. And Tom Nichols, I think, put it very well. And when he said, "Dear Rubes, you might have a few nickels and dimes left. Please send them to me," because all he's doing right now is fundraising. And similarly, I think you can see on his support right now, there's a fundraising email he's got out calling for people to support the senators in the runoff elections in Georgia. But if you read the fine print, which very few people do, that money does not actually go to the Republican senators who are fighting for survival in Georgia. It goes to the Trump campaign. It goes to Donald Trump. So part of this is simply a grift. It's simply let's raise money off this issue. So that actually, though, brings up an interesting question. So one of the things that happened today is that, sorry, somebody asked me to do that. I hope that works. Somebody has, I'm sorry, today the Senate went ahead and under Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell acknowledged that Joe Biden has been elected president. And that was really interesting not because it was any surprise. I mean, it's months late, frankly, but because there's a problem for the Trump supporters in the House right now. And let me just remind you that the House tends to be a lot more radical than the Senate. And here's why. Because with the gerrymandering that has taken place on the Republican side, especially since 2010, and what that means is that when the state legislatures divide up the different congressional districts, especially after 2010, they made Republican districts extremely Republican. So Republicans don't really have to worry in those districts about approaching the middle at all. What they do need to worry about is making sure that nobody on the right takes them out. So they have moved very, very far to the right. And what that means is that the House GOP, the GOP is an old nickname for Republicans. It used to mean the grand old party, and nobody uses it anymore except people like me who study the old texts. So I'm sorry when I say that. It's just that I forget. The Republicans in certain districts have moved quite far right. Like if you go online and you Google the congressional district for Jim Jordan of Ohio, who's a real heavy Trumper, far right to the right. His district looks like this, and so the House tends to be a lot more extreme right than the Senate does, because they can't do that. You don't vote for senators by district, you vote by state, so they're not really able to do that the way that the House is. So they tend to be a lot more moderate. And what that also means is that, frankly, those districts on the Republican side are not sending their best. They don't need to send their best because they know they're going to get elected, which is exactly how we've managed to get at least one and maybe two sort of racist, xenophobic, far-right QAnon supporters elected from those sorts of Republican districts, is because it doesn't matter. I mean, you could elect a twig from an oak tree in those districts to be the Republican members of the House, because that's the way the gerrymandering works. So they did something really stupid here. And that, I mean, aside from any of the obvious things, and that is that the Republicans in the Senate went ahead and they set a date for themselves. And they said, okay, after the Electoral College meets and casts its vote, that's when we will recognize Joe Biden. So what that did is it gave them time to go ahead and flirt with the Trump's base that didn't want to acknowledge that Biden had won, but it gave them an off-ramp so they could play with the crazy but not be bound to it. And the House Republicans did not do that. So you look at something like Ellis has said today, or like some of the House Congress people have said, where is the off ramp? I mean, unless you have given yourself a moment to say, okay, I'm going to go this far and no further, they don't really have a way to get off. And that was I think really stupid for them, but it also is a real problem. Like, where do they say, oh, never mind, Joe Biden is president? And that is, I think, going to be a problem going forward that I may or may not manage to speak to later on today. So that raises up the question. There's a number of questions you people had, and I'm trying to wrap them all together. So that raises the question of, what about those 126 members of the House delegation, Republican members of the Republican House delegation, who went ahead and backed Texas's lawsuit trying to get thrown out the votes of 4 swing states that voted for Biden and not for Trump. So what they were doing when that lawsuit, the Texas lawsuit of just last week now, was an extraordinary lawsuit. And as I say, the Supreme Court decided against it 0-9. What they were trying to do, it's a little bit more complicated than that because there were 2 pieces to it, but I'm sure someone's going to argue with me, but okay. The point is, the Supreme Court decided, firmly against that lawsuit. So what they were literally trying to do was they were trying to make the argument that Texas's voters were hurt because they wanted Donald Trump to be president, and they were hurt by the other states' voting systems because they enabled Joe Biden to become president. And that was just a non-starter, because our states actually manage their own voting systems, and that would basically say, well, we're going to have to do everything from a federal level, and there was no way that this Supreme Court was going to decide that. But what that meant was that 126 Republican members of Congress signed on to what was essentially an attempt to overturn an election, because, as I say, Biden did not lose by a little bit. This is not contested. This is literally an attempt of Republicans to say that electing a Democrat is illegitimate. And as I hope you've heard me say repeatedly, the idea of a 2-party system in which it's okay for either party to run things is essential to a democracy, at least a 2-party system. I don't care if there's 2 or 25, but there have to be at least 2, because otherwise you have a 1-party system and it's no longer capable of being a democracy, because it doesn't have oversight and it doesn't give a way for people who disagree with the leaders in power to feel like they can never take power again. So they were literally trying to destroy our American system. That's no small thing. And as you look, they were not major figures for the most part. As I say, they didn't, they're partisans, they're not statesmen. I'm not even sure most of them understood what was going on. And a great number of them, I think, took a look at that particular case and recognized that there was no way that the Supreme Court was going to say yes. So it was an easy way for them to, sort of be nice to Donald Trump and avoid having him tweet angry things at them, but also know that they weren't going to win. Sort of the same way a 2-year-old, pitches a fit around mom and not around a stranger, because they know that, mom's going to handle things and they don't really know what a stranger is going to do. So that, it was a safe kind of thing to do. But now this leaves hanging out there the fact that 126 members of of Congress wanted to destroy our country. But so here's the question. People are like, let's not seat them. Let's do something about this. And you've asked questions about this, and I will be interested to see how this plays out. We are completely on untrodden ground here. This has never happened before. Somebody said, is this common, just do for this many people to turn against the electoral system and the way we've run our country? And the answer is no. This is absolutely unprecedented. Even during 1860, when the Southerners left Congress, to the degree they were even in Congress at that point, because the election is in November and Congress stopped seating in early shortly after that. But even to that degree, those people left. They weren't trying to come into the government and turn it around. I guess if there's any comparison, it might be 1879, when a number of Southern Democrats tried to defund the government in order to destroy it, and they got handily put down. So we've never had a moment like this, and people are asking what's going to happen. Well, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't think it should go unnoticed, but people are asking about sedition. And the trick to our laws about sedition, mind you, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm doing this off the top of my head. Our laws about sedition have changed a lot over the years, but sedition is almost always tied to the idea of advocating violent overthrow. And they didn't advocate violent overthrow. They advocated procedural overthrow. And that itself is very interesting in terms of the sanctity of a nation state. The fact that they have decided to use or trying to use the political system rather than trying to use force is very telling. Because I think what it says is, for all the talk of people like Rush Limbaugh about secession and, we don't really need those people, the answer is not that the Republican Party as it's constituted today wants to divide the country. They simply want to rule the country, because they know full well that they need the money that comes in from the blue-dominated states, from California and New York, and the money that comes into Texas, because many of the Republican-dominated states actually get money from the blue states. So it's interesting that they're not saying, no, we want to take our marbles and go home. They're saying, we want to stay here, but we want to take your marbles too. And that's just a very different kind of thing than we've ever had before, and one that I think is going to have to be addressed, because this is not going to go away. And I hope to get more to that in a minute. So I hope that, so look at this. We've got some, we've got QAnon people here making, anyway, maybe I'll have time to talk about that too. All right. So now your question is, how did Trump manage to do this? How did he manage to essentially create this crisis in just 4 years? And there's two things at stake there. And one of the ones that I want to really emphasize here is that this is not a Trump problem. It is partly. He is certainly a unique character, and he was able to pull some stuff off because of the fact he's such a unique character. But what we've had going on here is classic. It's a classic situation that Americans refused to believe was happening to them, because we sort of felt like World War II inoculated us against the rise of ideologies that were essentially authoritarian ideologies, and in this case, fascism. Now, I'm not talking about whether or not Trump and the Republican Party are fascist, because in fact, I don't think they are. I think that they are authoritarian, but they embrace a different kind of authoritarianism than fascism. And that's probably a distinction that most people here don't care about right now, although I'm happy to talk about those distinctions at some point. But the point here is that the way a country gets an authoritarian leader is pretty clear for those of us who study history. And it's a really interesting problem, because, of course, America was a democracy. So you sit there and you look at a democracy and you say, wait a minute, how did people actually vote to create what is essentially an autocracy? I mean, how did they vote away their freedom? And why did they vote away their freedom? Because that's crazy if you step back and look at it. But there's answers to that, and the answers to that come from theoreticians, mostly like Hannah Arendt, who wrote after World War II, and also one of the people I love when he writes, because of, I'll explain why in a minute, a man named Eric Hoffer, who wrote a book called True Believers in the wake of World War II. He wrote in 1951, I think, off the top of my head. And in True Believers, he said, stop worrying about Mussolini and Hitler, which is who everybody was studying at the time. He said, every generation, every era, every country has authoritarians inherent in the population. The question is not why there are those people. The question is why anybody follows them, because they're always there. So what creates a society that makes people want to follow a dictator like a Hitler or a Mussolini, or any of the other many dictators that have arisen in American society? And what he argued was this, and I think it works really particularly well in America right now, especially in the wake of 1981. And that is that they said, well, what happens is a population gets destabilized, either on purpose or by accident. And the population becomes destabilized either economically or culturally or religiously. The people who are in a population start to feel unsettled, and they start to feel as if they have lost ground, that they're not doing as well as they used to be. And that might be because new immigrants come in. It might be because of an economic crisis. It might be because of secularization. It might be any number of things. But you unsettle a population, so they're anxious, and they're having trouble making ends meet, and they're having trouble feeling good about themselves. They don't feel like they're in control any longer. And when that happens, what prepares the population for the rise of a dictator is leaders who start to gather power, not by saying, hey, listen, let's work together to fix these problems, but by saying, your problems are all caused by them. Now, who them is doesn't really matter, so long as you suggest to the people that those other people are responsible for whatever problems they're experiencing. And when that happens, when people start to say, yeah, we used to be fine except for those people, and they start to talk about the past as if it was a golden age in which they held power, and that moment has been ruined by those people. And again, who those people are doesn't matter at all. The whole point of creating that other is to make your group coherent. And when that happens, it's only a question of time until you get stronger and stronger leaders saying, I am the one who can solve this. I am the one who can work with you people here, my supporters, to take back our country from those people. Now there's another step, though, that Hoffer pointed to that is so effective. And he talked a lot about language. That's why I like him versus some of the other theoreticians, because I believe that language really shapes politics. So, and I've talked about that elsewhere. So when that happens, you get the rise of somebody who says, yeah, I'm it. I'm the one who's really going to make the country great again. And in order to do that, you have to be on my side. And when you're on my side, we're going to treat those people really badly. We're going to discriminate against them in laws. And that's hard, according to Hoffer, for human beings to do, because they don't like to think badly about themselves. As I always tell my students, nobody wakes up in the morning and puts their feet on the ground and says, today I'm going to be a jerk. They put their feet on the ground and they say, today I'm going to save America, or today I'm going to, do whatever it takes to achieve a good goal. So they say, we're going to do that. We're going to take our country back. And in order to do that, we're going to have to hurt those people. And in order for people to get their heads around that, they have to say, okay, I'm okay hurting those people because it's going to be good for these people. But the problem with that, according to Hoffer, is that once you have started to hurt those other people in whatever way, and let me just throw out kids in cages right here, in order to live with your head, you have to say, that was a good thing to do. I only did that because they asked for it, because they were bad. And once you have done that, you've started to dehumanize those people. And if they're that bad and they're not really like you, if those, children in cages were real children, you could never have done that if they were real children. But because they're not real children, you can do that, and maybe you should do a little bit worse. But the problem with that, according to Hoffer, is that once you have gone down that road, you can't walk away from that leader, because then you would have to admit the terrible things that you had done. And that is psychologically incredibly difficult for people to do, to say, oh my God, I'm one of these people who created this disaster. So the worse things get, the tighter those cling to a dictator. And my example of this is always Bellatrix Lestrange in Harry Potter. The worse that Voldemort behaves toward her and toward the Malfoys, the tighter she clings to him, because otherwise she'd have to admit to herself that she had chosen Voldemort over Narcissa and Draco and all the other Malfoys, her flesh and blood. She had to believe that they were not strong enough, that they were the bad guys, rather than the person to whom she had given her allegiance, because it wasn't about him, it was about her. And that is, I think, why Trump ended up and is now as powerful as he is, because, as I said about the congressmen who didn't give themselves an off-ramp, at what point do you say, gee, I was wrong, and now I need to make amends for the fact that I was responsible for, all the list of things that happened on my watch, the attacks on American democracy, the attacks on immigrants, the attacks on African Americans, the attacks on women. That's all on me. And this is one of the reasons that I follow, I believe it's David Weissman. Unfortunately, I only see the name in my head. I don't know how you pronounce it. On Twitter, he was, I believe, a neo-Nazi, and he had a come to reality moment and has begged forgiveness and is doing his best to clean up the mess that he made. And that is, aside from anything else, psychologically, that is unbelievably difficult to do. So now the question is not so much Trump, who is perhaps tapping into these psychological trends that Hoffer recognized. The issue then is us. How did we get to this point? And I would suggest to you that the way that our population in America was destabilized was first, of course, the 1960s and the 1970s. But the 1960s were destabilized by people who were looking for equality. That wasn't really a problem. And then they were really destabilized by assassins. That was a problem. Then the 1970s were destabilized by the OPEC crisis and the gas shortages, the fact that the cost of oil went through the roof and we had gas shortages, and then the hostage crisis after in the late 70s, and then finally with Russia invading Afghanistan in 79. But all of those things were external to America. They were not internal. But think about how that played out. That's exactly what Ronald Reagan weaponized in order to rise to power and be elected in 1980. And when he was elected, he was not overwhelmingly popular. People remember him as being wildly popular, but that's because they were remembering 1980, the next election, 1984, when he did win by a huge amount, but he didn't win by that much in 1980. And he won by painting Jimmy Carter as being a complete loser, and he lied about Carter's record and all that. But then once the Republicans were in power under Ronald Reagan, they began to pass legislation, beginning with Reagan's first tax cut and then with the second tax cut in '86, that really began to move money upward really dramatically. So the economy began to favor people at the very top, not the vast majority of us. And this is not controversial. What I'm saying is not at all controversial. And as that has happened, as America has become more and more and more destabilized and money has moved up more and more and more and more and more, our population has been really susceptible to the language that those Republicans used, in which they said, hey, The problem is not our legislation, which is moving money upward, although every chart you will look at will tell you that. The problem is African Americans, Mexican Americans, Indigenous Americans, women, people who want a government handout. Well, now you look at any chart and you will know that our money is not going to the bottom of society. Our money's going upward. But they have put forward this narrative that people really believed. And that's what Donald Trump rode to power on. Reminding you, as I like to do, that when Trump rose in 2016, he was the most moderate on the stage, the most moderate Republican on the stage. Remember, he called for fairer taxes. He called for universal health care. He called for, for making everyone pay their fair share. He called for all sorts of things that the rest of the Republicans did not do. So the bigger question is not how did Trump do it? The question is, why did we elect Trump? And that brings the next point. How do we stop this from happening again? And I hope to end with that. But there are a few more specific questions that people asked that you might like me to get to before I talk about moving forward and how do we move forward. I was going to say, I just have Mitch here. So, and I was trying to think of what I was saying. You people have also asked, a lot of you have asked about the theory going around that Kamala Harris, as the president of the Senate, because the vice president in the Constitution is the president of the Senate, if she can shut up Mitch McConnell and make him actually bring things to the floor. My answer to that is, I don't know. Here's the way it plays out. Yes, theoretically, yes, because the person who presides over the Senate, according to the Constitution, is the vice president. But that's a little bit fallen into disuse since about 1890, and it was really beginning with Lyndon Baines Johnson in the early 60s. He moved the offices of the vice president out of the legislative buildings and into the executive office. So the vice president's role has really been more in the executive branch since the 1960s. That being said, if it were me, sure, I would push that really hard. And what the presiding officer can do in the Senate, the presiding officer can't vote and can't speak, but the presiding officer can recognize people. So the argument is that she could reassert the authority of the vice president over the Senate and hop into the Senate and recognize people. She couldn't speak herself, but she could recognize people, and they would then introduce legislation that the House had passed, because of course McConnell has simply refused to bring to the House bring to the Senate anything that the House has passed. He calls himself the Grim Reaper, and that's why the Congress hasn't done anything for that the Democrats have wanted for months, for years. So she could do that. Certainly she could at least assert that authority. The two places that runs into trouble is it's certainly possible that if in fact the Republicans win the 2 Senate seats in Georgia, they'll simply ignore that because they will hold a majority in the Senate. The other place that runs into a bit of a problem, and again something that's going to have to be addressed going forward in the future, is that the reason Mitch McConnell holds so much power is a stupid reason. To my mind, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it's a Senate, but the Senate Majority Leader makes up the calendar. So he makes up the calendar and he gets to work with to decide what comes to the floor. And he simply refuses to put stuff on the calendar. And the person who presides over the Senate does not, I believe, have the ability to make up the calendar. And I don't know the answer to that. So that's a maybe. It's a definitive maybe, if you will. I think what people are waiting for is to see how the election in Georgia comes out, because if in fact the Democrats win in that election, and they ought to, they're, Loeffler and Purdue are just corrupt. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say. I don't think that's really very controversial, to be honest. I'm sorry if I offended anybody by saying that, but Loeffler is, they're both under ethics investigations, and Purdue won't even show up to debates because he's terrified he's going to incriminate himself. So, anyway, if those go Democratic, then it's a moot point, because it'll be a 50-50 split, and Kamala Harris will cast a deciding vote. And the Senate Majority Leader, if it's a 50-50 split, the Senate Majority Leader belongs to the party who has the White House. So they'll pick a Majority Leader from somewhere. in the Democratic ranks. Not necessarily Chuck Schumer. He's the Senate Minority Leader now, but there'll be a new election, and who knows. So I think people are kind of waiting on that to see how it plays out, and waiting on this. And this is something I wanted to make sure to get to today, and that is that Mitch McConnell has said today, I believe, I haven't read the news very thoroughly today, but I believe he has made it a point of saying that he is going to bring forward a coronavirus relief bill. Well, it's about freaking time. So what made him do that? Why now? And the answer to why now is public pressure. And so one of the things that needs to happen is Americans need to talk about what they want. If all the Congress people are hearing is from their supporters saying, yeah, you go ahead and make sure Democrats don't get anything done, then that's what they're going to do. But if people write repeatedly, and especially call, and emailing is not so good, but writing and calling and say, do something, they do respond to that because they want to be reelected. Now, Mitch McConnell is not going to answer to, somebody from Massachusetts, but he is going to answer to pressure from the other Congress people, the other senators he has to deal with. So one of the ways to neutralize, I feel like everyone's waiting for somebody else to save the country, and we're the ones who are supposed to be saving the country because they have to answer to us. And that's a really important thing to remember. I would also point out that many of the congressional leaders right now are quite old. So putting pressure on younger people is a really important way to change the way the country is moving. All right, so people have asked me a few more questions here that I hope to get to, and that is, first of all, why on earth did Trump fire Barr now? Lots of possible reasons for that. One is that he's just mad. I mean, one of the things that has always concerned me deeply about President Trump is that he does appear, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm an older woman who has seen a lot of behavior in my 58 years. He behaves in ways that imitate a certain kind of character, and it's characteristics that have been associated with a personality trait called narcissism. And the problem with narcissists is that when they don't win, when they don't get their way, they want to do as much damage as they possibly can to take revenge on the people who didn't support them. And I've always been concerned, as many people have been, this is not new to me, that he would just burn it all down on the way out. And so partly he is just settling scores with people like Barr. He's mad that Barr came out on December 1st and said that there was no fraud, that it had affected the election. And that really pulled the rug out from Trump being able to argue that he had in fact won the election. So partly he's just mad. And the two men have been at odds really since then. And Trump and Barr had really been carrying Trump's water in a really big way until then. I mean, think about it. As soon as he came into office, he whitewashed the Mueller report. You might have forgotten that, but he came out right away and said, "Oh, it's fine. It says there's no collusion." He completely misrepresented it. The Mueller report was actually pretty damning, even though it refused to take on any of the issues having to do with whether or not Trump might have committed some sort of illegalities, because it was under the Department of Justice. And after that 1973 memo, Mueller said, I couldn't look at those things. More interesting to me is the Senate report, the report of the Senate Intelligence Committee, which didn't have those restrictions on it, and in fact is quite damning about the 2016 Trump campaign. And I'm just so tired of people saying, oh, there was no collusion. There is no legal definition of collusion. So of course nobody came out and said, yes, he colluded, but the evidence is really damning in especially the 5th volume of the Senate Senate Intelligence Committee's report on the investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 election. You can read it yourself. It's online. All you do is put in just what I said, the Senate Intelligence Committee report. You actually don't need more than that. That's what comes up. And you probably want volume 5. And if you open it up, it's going to look really confusing, and you're going to be like, oh, Richardson thinks I can read this and I can't. That's because for some reason when they make government documents, they put the index in the front. I really have never understood that, but they do. And so you get completely overwhelmed and you think, oh, this isn't for me. This is for lawyers. Don't read that. You don't need to read the index. Go to when they first start having pages, and the beginning of the Senate reports, there's like a 2 at most 4-page summary of what's in all those 1,000 pages. And it's all the highlights. And it's totally readable. It's written for a popular audience. It's not legalese. It says, this is what we found. And I highly recommend everybody read it, especially in response when your uncle says, oh, there was no collusion. Especially volume 5, but also volumes 1 and 2, and 3 and 4, as I recall, are much more procedural and much less interesting for most people. But yeah, so anyway, so the first thing out of the box that Barr did was he whitewashed all that, and he has given favors to Trump's buddies, and he may you probably missed this. I kept having a file open to write about it, and I never did. When there was a woman who, many women, of course, but there's one particular woman who I'm afraid her name is escaping me off the top of my head, Jean Carroll? Don't quote me on that. Had accused Trump of sexual assault, and he called her a liar, and she sued him for defamation. And that was supposed to go forward in the courts, and she was doing very well in the courts when the Department of Justice stepped in and took the case over. So she was no longer suing Trump as an individual because this assault happened, and the accusation that she was the assault happened before he became president. The Justice Department stepped in and said, yes, this is a case that we will take on. And, people are looking at it going, the fact he said he apparently committed sexual assault and then defamed the woman who accused him of that. She didn't sue him for that. She sued him for the defamation. What does that have to do with being president of the United States? Well, really nothing, but Barr stepped in, and so this woman was then having to deal with the Department of Justice, which is just, we'll see what happens with that. But anyway, so there was that. There was letting Roger Stone off. There was Flynn. He really carried a lot of water. And so why now is he out? Partly because they're angry, and Trump wants to hurt people. I would also point out that it is not an accident, I think, that he has started so many federal executions. I think he is just mad, and he is enjoying the power of life and death. That's a personal opinion, but why on earth is the federal government suddenly starting to execute people at an unbelievable rate? I believe we've executed 13 people since the 1970s, and some unbelievable percentage of those is in the last couple of weeks. So partly because he's mad, but also partly because it might be that Barr wants to get out for any number of reasons. He might want to get out because he is hoping to get a pardon from Donald Trump himself for things that he may or may not have done, but also potentially because he knows that Trump is going to start pardoning people that he does not want to be associated with. And that's saying something because, of course, it was Barr who urged the pardoning of a number of people who were involved in the Iran-Contra affair that a lot of people thought should not have been pardoned. He was part of that. So it may be partly that he simply wants to get clear of the Department of Justice before Trump starts pardoning people and leave that to someone else to have to deal with. But who knows? Maybe they just have had it with each other. Barr is a really interesting character, and I'm not going to go more into him right now. So, because I've only got a few minutes left. So, a couple of questions here about Biden that I wanted to answer. And obviously, I can't wait to begin talking about Biden. And again, I'll keep doing this as long as you people are interested. They began really just to keep people entertained during the pandemic. I didn't have a plan, and I hope they're useful. I am enjoying doing the Reconstruction one on Thursday, by the way. But I'm not, I sort of feel like, don't feel like you have to keep coming to these. But I would love to talk about Biden because Biden's a really interesting character. And people have asked, what should Biden do and what is Biden doing? Now, I've only got 8 or 10 minutes left here. So what should Biden do? I'm going to answer next. What is Biden doing right now is really interesting. And what he should do, I think, is interesting too. So what he is doing is everyone's got a problem, right? So Trump's got his own problems. Biden's got huge problems. And the problems are these. First of all, Trump and his administration are salting the earth on the way out. They have as you know from my writing the other night, currently there's not money to distribute the vaccine for the virus after February 1st, although one hopes that the Congress will provide that with this new coronavirus bill that they were supposed to announce while I was on this talk. So I don't know if it's happened or not. They've put their cronies all through things. They've killed the State Department. They've gone ahead and started a fuss with Iran. They've pulled out of the climate accords. Any place they could cause trouble, they have done so. And he's going to have to deal with all that. It looks very much like what the Harrison administration did to the Cleveland administration in 1892. And, it led to the Panic of 1893, and Cleveland never recovered. So Biden's got to deal with all of those problems. But he's also got to manage the issue that a number of Republicans don't believe he's legitimate and have vowed not to work with him. And you really don't want to have a democracy in which it's all or nothing. You really do want to rebuild some kind of a compromise, but you can't compromise with these people. And he's no fool, by the way. He talked about, I'm going to compromise and we're going to work together. I think he really means that. But unlike Obama, who was like, I'm going to manage to work with anybody, Biden's an older man who's seen people, and he recognizes that there's some people you can't work with. So he's going to find common ground. And if he can't find common ground, he's going to cut those people loose. At least that's my reading of the situation. He wanted to convince people who were nervous about that before the election to vote for him, but he's not stupid. All right, so he is trying to bring people on board. So he's got the problem on the right, but he's also got a problem on the left. And the problem on the left is that it's always a problem in the American left. And that is that there's two pieces to the American left, and this can be a quick talk here. It should be a lot longer. It took me a long time to figure this out. So, the right tries to say everybody on the left is a communist or a socialist, but that's not even vaguely true. Like, most people that are considered on the left and who tend to vote Democratic are considered liberals, small L liberals. And what that means in modern society, because that name's changed a lot, I've done talk about that. But what that means in modern society is they believe the government has a role to play in regulating business and providing a basic social safety net and promoting infrastructure. They don't agree on what that role is, but they believe that the government has a role to play in those things, that the government actually is supposed to step in to make things a little bit fairer. That's not true of the people on the right. It used to be true of the liberals on the right, the Eisenhower Republicans, who used to say, yeah, we believe in all those things. We just disagree with the way the people on the left are doing it. So you had these people in the middle, and they fought about things, but they basically agreed the government should do this stuff. They just disagreed about how the government should do this stuff. Those moderate Republicans still exist in the real world. Lots of them. You write to me. But they've been completely taken over in the Republican leadership by the far right that says the government does not have that role. The government should never regulate business, provide a basic social safety net, or promote infrastructure, which should be done by private enterprise. And so you've lost those liberals on the right. So we've lost those people. And all we've got now are the extreme right in the leadership. Like I say, the voters are still there. And a lot of them are voting Republican because they can't bring themselves to vote Democratic, but they don't like the way the party has gone. And this is why I keep pushing on them to speak up and take their party back, because there's a lot more of them than there are that far right. I promise you. I just promise you that. And they're leaving. They're leaving the party in droves and becoming independents. So that's no longer the case. We've lost those people. On the left, though, you have the liberals, the people who believe that the government has this role to play. And as I say, now a lot of people from the right have jumped into that liberal pool on the left because there is no place for them on the right any longer. But then there's the people on the more far left who don't consider themselves liberals. They consider themselves leftists, and they don't really like this whole idea of the capitalist system the way it currently exists. And they have a much more sweeping vision for reworking American society. Now, the thing that's a little frustrating for people like me who talk about philosophy is that for all the fact that people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is referred to as a socialist and sometimes calls herself a democratic socialist, she's really not that far out of, I don't think she's really out of mainstream liberalism. I mean, frankly, she looks a lot like an Eisenhower Republican in the 1950s. So but there is this identification that the more progressive wing of the liberals, so the people who sometimes identify themselves on the left, and they're not communists. They're not, some of them may be socialists, but they're not communists. They're really not. I mean, don't start me on that. So I do know communists, by the way. There are communists in America, but just not very many of them. So Biden's got to negotiate between these two groups. And the problem is, on the left, is that everybody thinks their issue is the big issue. Like on the right, they're like, we don't care. We're just going to elect whoever you tell us to, because we know that we all got to hang together to get elected. Biden's got to negotiate with all these different groups. At the same time, he doesn't lose the people he needs in that sort of rightish area, because he doesn't want to divide the country entirely in two. So he's trying to walk this line, including as many people in his cabinet and in his positions as he possibly can. And you can see when he nominated Neera Tanden for something, for example, the Republicans are mad about her, but so are a number of progressives. And he, it just is what it is. You don't see that on the right, where they say, I don't like that guy, he's not enough on my side. They're like, we don't care, whoever you want. On the left, he's got to go ahead and try and make all these groups happy. And the whole point of the way this works is that you can't keep everyone on the left happy, because they will say, we don't like that one person. And so he's trying to nail all these different groups together. And one of the things that I keep emphasizing is, I don't like everybody he nominates. You don't like everybody he nominates. But the point is, do you like the team? Do you like the direction the team is going? Because that's how you're going to go ahead and affect the way society moves. Whereas if you splinter, you're handing the government back over to people on the far right. And I'm not okay with that. I don't belong on the far right. But then there's something else that Biden is doing that I think, as a scholar, I'm going to speak as a scholar here, is fascinating. And that is that Biden is recognizing, in a way that the Democratic Party has really not articulated before, that since the 1960s, the base of the base of the Democratic Party, the people they could always rely on were people of color, especially African Americans, Black Americans. The Hispanic community tends to maybe be a little bit weaker around the edges in some places for the Democrats. But he's recognizing that. And what he is doing by recognizing that is he is really honoring the democratic traditional belief that the government should literally look like the people who live in this country. And that is something that, if you look at the contrast between that administration, which has women and African American women and Hispanic people and indigenous people, it looks like our country looks. Not entirely, and he hasn't finished it yet. But if you compare that to Trump's administration, which is overwhelmingly white men, it's a really important statement about what the future of our government should look like. And it's a really important statement because the reason that all of this matters at all is because we've got other democracies. If America goes down in flames, whatever, another country will take up the mantle of democracy, except that what makes America different is that we have the opportunity to be the first real multicultural democracy in the world. And he's taking that step to make that happen. And the backlash against it is going to be extraordinary by all those people I talked about before who said, oh, I've been displaced. I want, my 1950s back, when people of color stayed where they belonged and women were in the home, and I want that to come back. He's taking a really bold step to say that's never coming back. I was part of that. It's never coming back. We're rebuilding for the future. And he's doing that by the people he's putting in his cabinet. So there's one other piece that I want to add here just for a second. And that's what about how are we going to stop? What should Biden do going forward with the Trump people? And I feel very strongly about this. What America stands for is equality before the law. And I'm old, as I say, I've been doing this a long time. And one of the tragic mistakes that happened in America was Reconstruction. And one of the major issues with Reconstruction was the fact that nobody ever bore a penalty for trying to destroy this country. Now, Lots of people died during Reconstruction. The death toll during Reconstruction was extraordinarily high. Don't ever forget that. But it was high among the people who supported the United States government. The people who got away free were the people who tried to destroy the government. The people who died were the African Americans who tried to support it. So the idea that somehow Reconstruction was bloodless is wrong. And had the American government made it expensive to have supported the Confederacy, I don't think it ever would have risen again. And I don't mean literally expensive, although maybe I do. What I mean is that the United States government should have held to legal account the people who tried to destroy the American government in the 1860s. And it should have continued that policy that no person is above the law ever since. The other big mistake that we made was after Nixon's resignation in 1974, when Gerald Ford pardoned him for anything he had done or might have done. Because what that did is it gave a get out of jail free card, or rather a free pass for presidents going forward. And I firmly believe that if we had not let Nixon off the hook, that we would not have had the Iran-Contra affair, because Ronald Reagan would have recognized that he could have gone to prison, and Oliver North would not have been able to, and John Poindexter would not have been able to get away with that scheme. I firmly believe we would not have had weapons of mass destruction and the Iraq War in any case. And I don't think Donald Trump ever would have run for president. So one of the things I feel really strongly about going forward is, I do not believe that there should be some sort of extrajudicial system in place for the crimes that may or may not have been committed during the Trump administration. But I feel very strongly that those people should have to go to court. If they have committed crimes, they should be indicted and they should be tried. And that should work its way through the court system, and that there should be a penalty for trying to destroy this country. All right, I went a few minutes over, and I'm sorry about that. It was a little bit loosey-goosey this week. I hope that was of some interest. I'm going to go check the news myself now. And then I will sit down and start writing. You can tell I'm trying to write earlier these days, after realizing that my partner and I aren't even in the same time zone any longer. And so I'll see you tonight, and I will be back on Thursday with Congressional Reconstruction, which is the 14th Amendment, and really interesting stuff. So I hope to see you then. Thank you for being here today. Again, I do not speak for my employer when I do these, and keep the faith.